Hello everyone. As some of you know, in early 2024, my identity was stolen. Have fun, right? That's how I got to ring in the new year. But this past December, the perpetrator who had pleaded guilty was sentenced. So I thought I might share my experience, my mentality perspective, not just as a victim, but as an attorney and a former assistant prosecutor, as I thought that my experience or my outlook might be a bit unique because of that. I don't have much to say about the offense itself because you don't need me to tell you that being the victim of identity theft is awful, just awful. I mean, it's a huge feeling of just utter powerlessness, how you're going to be able to address it or deal with it. The biggest issue is what you don't know, not what you do, right? If you know how your information has been used, you can try to contact those entities and get something to happen, but you don't know if your information's been sold to other people, if how it's already been used, how it will be used until that person ends up being caught by law enforcement, if they're caught. It's just a huge feeling of the unknown. It's unlike let's say a basic theft offense, right? That's a fixed point in time. Someone is going by, sees something unguarded, steals it, walks away with it. That's a bit different than just a constantly, the constant unknown is of your personal information being used in other ways and the like, and trying to get ahead of that. Just by way of example, my best friend recommended I lock down my credit, which I did. And I started getting letters in the mail to the effect of, your application can't be processed because your credit is locked or something like that. And I had to reach out to those entities. I had to say, hey, I didn't apply for anything. Please deny it. Please get rid of it, dismiss, what have you. I don't want whatever this is. And in terms of how I even found out, I was extremely lucky and I have a lot of gratitude for the people involved. There were 2 dealerships where my information was used, allegedly by the same person. I say alleged because the defendant was charged for conduct at one of the dealerships, and that's what he pleaded to. So anything else I'm talking about is just alleged. There's only one thing that there's actually a plea to. And so one of the dealerships, a person was suspicious, looked for a phone number for me. It happened to be a number at an office I used to work at, and it went through a chain of people, ended up through some former colleagues, and I was able to get the information, contact the dealerships, and at least have a better understanding as to, what the heck was going on. And that was just a bit overwhelming because it was very unexpected and out of left field. And I had a feeling at this point too, of A, how I can protect myself, and and B, what was going to happen when I reported it to law enforcement. The thing is that certain prosecutors' offices have a reputation, in terms of how they deal with crime. Perhaps some have a reputation as to if a crime isn't a violent crime, how they deal with it, or whether they just please stuff down, or what if anything is done in terms of respect for victims and the like. And so there's a big open-ended question there too. If I report this, is any action going to be taken? I mean, think about it. If you're a law enforcement agency and you have limited manpower and limited resources, and no matter how much work you put in, no matter how robust the file is, no matter how clear the case is, the prosecutor's office you submitted to either isn't going to charge or isn't going to treat it with seriousness, is it really going to end up a priority? Is it logical to do that given that there are more victims that, that you can potentially pursue justice for? So again, it was a big question in my mind as to what was going to go on. So I ended up getting in touch with the Michigan State Police trooper who had been contacted. He had gotten information from the dealerships already. And a big shout out to Trooper Edwards. It was absolutely fantastic dealing with him because he was, very diligent. He was very knowledgeable. He had already, as I said, he talked to the dealerships and he was able to give me a sort of rundown to be able to protect myself, right? He told me he wanted me to be able to take something to the effect of wanting to do what I could to protect myself, to know the situation. And he was also very open to listening to me though. At no point did I thought he was just being dismissive or didn't want to do any work on the case. He wanted to know, what information I had. And this is an area that being an attorney, and I'd say a former prosecutor too, came in handy. I didn't prosecute identity theft, but I obviously know the rules of evidence quite well. I know the type of things that are going to be admissible in court. I know the type of things that, a prosecutor's office is typically going to want to see during the warrant process. So when talking to those dealerships and knowing what they had available, what had gone on, I was able to get a good handle from the legal perspective and, share what I knew with what Trooper Edwards already knew. And yeah, he was definitely someone who understood the types of cases. He very much seemed to think that, okay, I'm going to see what I could do in terms of an investigation. Within a short period of time, he went to the dealerships himself to collect evidence, collect information, and be able to make that assessment, based on his knowledge and experience. And from what he saw, there was a case there. And he is willing to put in the work to identify the person and to be able to actually address the crime, which I was incredibly grateful for. He ended up using facial recognition software, and it was able to conduct an investigation himself, look at addresses that were linked to the individual who was the suspect at the time, and at the end of the day, got a whole packet together. One of the things that was very nice that he did is he periodically gave me updates. Again, I used the term powerless before, and that's really the only feeling. When you're in court, you're an advocate for someone. You can fight. You know what you need to get, whether it be from your client or whether it be, again, on the prosecutor side, what you need to have available. You can compile and put together a case. You can research the law. You can put your best foot forward to be able to achieve some sort of justice or positive outcome for your client. And that's not the feeling when you're the victim. We have a Crime Victims' Rights Act in the state of Michigan. We have a constitutional provision in Michigan in terms of victims, but you are heavily, heavily reliant on essentially the agencies and entities that handle the criminal justice side of things. Because if they're not going to treat the victims with any level of dignity and respect, what are you really stuck with? Yeah, you can make an impact statement, but does the impact statement really matter? There's already been a plea that's been accepted. Particularly if it's a situation where the judge isn't in the position to set aside the plea. No, you end up essentially stuck. And so that just knowing that the case was being investigated and getting periodically just short updates as to where things were going was definitely left me with the impression as, okay, the justice system isn't leaving me behind, right? I'm not going to be someone who is, one of the very unfortunate people who I have a lot of sympathy for, who never end up getting to, see any true outcome or consequence where they're the victim of a crime. Eventually, it was determined that there's a good, solid case to move forward with, and the jurisdiction was in Eden County. So the matter went to the Eden County Prosecutor's Office for review. And I didn't know much of anything about the Eden County Prosecutor's Office. It was, an agency that I didn't have a experience with. And so, again, prosecutors' offices, a lot of them have reputations, not all of them positive. And so I really didn't know what to think going in. And I will say they were fantastic, hands down, in terms of, what I could hope for and how a case was handled. I don't think there's anything that was omitted. Their victim advocacy, for instance, the victim advocate I dealt with was prompt in updates, in returning emails. If I needed something, for instance, for scheduling purpose, it says I need to be able to provide verification that I did, in fact, the sentencing was on a particular day and I wanted to be able to attend. And, I got that. That was provided without any sort of issue. I was very happy. Messages were passed along to the attorneys. Just overall, it was a really good, solid level of victim advocacy that you would hope for. And, it frankly exceeded expectations. In terms of the attorneys, they were both fantastic as well. There was two I dealt with regularly on this, and that was Kayla Oberleiter, who handled the matter in district court, and Adam Strong, who handled the matter in circuit court. And both of them, from everything I saw, they were well prepared, they were knowledgeable, they were very skilled as attorneys, they were ready to proceed for a hearing. And the reality is, too, they both took the time to talk with me. One of the things, for instance, with Ms. Oberleiter, early on, we had a conversation in terms of potential pleas and dispositions. And she asked me, about the priorities that I had, what I'd like to see in terms of the case. And that was taken into account. Again, a prosecutor's office doesn't have to listen to a victim, right? You're not the one who is for sure steering the ship, that there's prosecutorial discretion. But from how it was described to me, they had a collaborative process in terms of discussing pleas, and what they ended up deciding upon was perfectly acceptable to me. I wasn't looking to, oh yeah, go to the top of the guidelines, exceed the guidelines, get the whole 2/3, anything like that. I just wanted a fair proportional outcome in terms of the case generally, right? I didn't want the case to be one of those that's just sort of, dumped away to a nothing reduction and move on like nothing happened. And, to their credit, that was the same thing with the Eden County Prosecutor's Office. They absolutely, seem to be focused on what is a fair proportional outcome. It was a meeting of the minds the entire process. Ms. Oberleiter, when I showed up to court, she was talked with me before and after, and as I said, very professional the entire time. When we had to show up for the exam, she was good to go there. Witnesses were lined up, everything was good. It kind of, unfortunately, the defendant ended up waiving the exam, so we weren't needed there. But I appreciate the work that had gone into it. And I know that without the effort that she put in, that justice wouldn't have been achieved. It was the same thing with Mr. Strong when it ended up going to him. He contacted me. He let me know where things stood, that the plea remained unchanged. And, one of the things I really appreciated is, him and the office as a whole didn't seem to have aversion to trial. I say that because a lot of attorneys seem to be, I guess the best term is scared of proceeding to trial. And don't get me wrong, you don't want to go to trial on every case, especially a lot of civil cases. You want an optimal outcome to the extent you could get it. But it's the same in criminal, right? There are times that the victim and the defendant, no one's really, shall we say, at each other's throats, right? You want just a fair outcome. The prosecuting attorney wants a fair outcome too. And there's a way to reach, a disposition that's going to leave everyone with a level of satisfaction of knowing, okay, this is fair, this is good, but, everyone can live with the situation. But there are some, and from my perspective, part of it is training and retention too. If you can't keep your good trial attorneys, you're not getting people ready for trial. But there are some who just do not seem to ever want to go to trial. It's the mentality almost of, I don't know if it's fear because you don't know what a jury is going to do, or, lack of self-confidence. But, again, this was not the case in Eden. And as an attorney, seeing people who were basically in the position of, no, we're going to litigate, we're going to do our jobs, we know the law, we're not afraid, was a very comforting feeling. It gave me a good sense of optimism too, a good sense of respect for the team there as well. So, as it moved forward, it ended up, obviously, the defendant ended up pleading guilty. He had another criminal matter in Eden, so it turned out to be a plea where the sentence agreed upon was concurrent, the length of probation and the terms was to be determined by the court, and I was able to make an impact statement. And I want to give another shout out, this time to the judge, the Honorable Judge Janice Cunningham. Because like the prosecutor's office there, I hadn't had any experience with her and didn't know her reputation, how she treated people generally. You can sometimes get a sense in terms of how judges, view criminal cases and the like. And from the cases I saw, again, there was a lot of just fairness and a lot of consideration for, where the parties were coming from. I didn't get the sense that she had any level of, for lack of a better term, bias or leaning. It just seemed to be, okay, what's a good outcome here? And when I got to make a statement, this was probably the weirdest part of the entire process. Because, I've appeared before district courts, circuit courts, I had the Michigan Court of Appeals, I've had a case in immigration court before, an administrative case. And so, again, when you appear, you are an advocate. You're there to argue the law. You're there to make, a presentation of facts in terms of the applicability. You are an advocate, for lack of a better term. And that's the role. It's the role that I'm used to and wanted to continue. But from my perspective, there's only so far you can go as a victim where until you're stepping on the toes of the assistant prosecutor, you're really getting outside the scope of what you should be doing, So I put my appearance on the record like I normally would, but then just, talked as the victim. And, I give a lot of credit to Judge Cunningham because she definitely was listening to what I had to say. I know that because during her sentencing and even when she was addressing the defendant, she brought up some of it. And that, again, is a wonderful feeling of, okay, the justice system is working. Again, judge doesn't have to agree with the victim, prosecutor doesn't, but there's sometimes you get the sense that the victim is either a formality or almost like a delay or an obstacle that, everyone knows what they want to do and, who cares what the victim has to say. And that wasn't the case here. I thought that Judge Cunningham gave a fair sentence. The defense attorney was quite gracious too, and respectful. Overall, the proceedings went well, and I left feeling like there had been justice done. That I was one of the people who was lucky enough to, maybe not lucky in terms of being the victim of a crime, but have people care about their jobs and care about their community, and care about the idea that victims should have rights and should have a basic dignity and respect, as well as defendants, right? And sort of where I suppose I would leave things at. It was a weird process to be stuck in that position where I, as a person who's normally the one fighting in the courtroom, had to essentially trust that other people were going to fight for me, and they did. I'm forever going to be grateful for that. So I want to give a big thank you again to Trooper Edwards, to Taylor Warren, Kayla Oberleiter, Adam Strong, and to Prosecutor Doug Lloyd. I'd say that I've never met Mr. Lloyd, but I can tell you from experience that how a prosecutor's office runs a lot of times is based on what the person at the top, how invested they are, what they care about. And I can tell you that, at least for my case and in my experience in Eden County, the office is well run, and the people are very much care. It did definitely as well too give me feelings of I don't know if you want to use the word nostalgia or sadness, as from my time being an APA. I was extern in Genesee County for back when I was in law school. I worked for 2 different administrations in Oakland County, and I love being an APA. I by no means regret my decision to leave the prosecutor's office in Oakland when I did, but I do miss my time as an APA. I do miss what I was able to do for my community in that capacity, and this was a difficult process, but having people with integrity really made it smoother. So at the end of the day, thank you all for listening, and thank you to everyone again who helped out. I hope things turn around for the defendant. I hope that this is a time in his life that he turns around, and looks back and says, that this is a time in his life where he made some poor decisions. And while he made some poor decisions, he can still move forward and decide that this isn't the path he wants to take. And I'm hopeful for that. At the end of the day, that's the whole idea of having a justice system, right? That you have consequences, that you do try to deal with all of the different aspects and the goals, the penological purposes of sentencing. But at the same time, when a person ends up serving their time, it pays their dues to society, they're able to move forward in a positive way. So I hope to everyone who's been a victim out there that you do end up finding justice yourself, that you have people fighting for you like I did. And I hope that everyone out here who listens to this, if you know someone who's a victim, that you stand with them through that difficult time in their life. But thank you so much. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. I'm happy to answer them. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.